Well, hello, Highrock family. My name is Brynn, and I am one of the pastors at Highrock North Shore, and I am so glad to be with you today. Put on earrings for you guys today because, like most of you, I am working from home. And like many of you, I've been watching way too much Netflix. My husband and I watched the entire season of Tiger King in just 2 days. But if I'm being honest, I don't just watch too much Netflix in quarantine. I watch a little too much TV in general. I just love a good story. You may have heard of a writer named Joseph Campbell, and he writes about this kind of pattern that most stories are written in. Now, when you think about it, storytellers have been telling their stories in a particular pattern for most of human history. Stories typically have 3 acts. You have Act 1. In Act 1, you meet the character, the protagonist, and they're called to some kind of life-altering adventure. And then in Act 2, it introduces some conflict. The protagonist looks for an easy way out, only to find that the only answer is to undergo some ultimate sacrifice or conflict or struggle. And then there's Act 3, redemption. The protagonist proves she's learned the lesson, and this is where we see the enlightenment, the transformation. Now, if you think about your favorite stories, they probably share this kind of pattern: character, conflict, redemption. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. And as humans, we love that pattern. We thrive on that. We eat that up. Except sometimes. Except when it's in real life. Except when it's our own story and it's happening to us. Now, in our own stories, we love the character development part, Act 1, and we love the redemption part, Act 3. It's just that middle part, the conflict part, Act 2, that's the part we're not so sure about. The part where the character has to go through something hard. Now, if you're anything like me, you'd rather just dispense of the conflict and get straight to the transformation part, to the prize, the Princess Peach, the final Horcrux, the Holy Grail. But that is not how good stories work. No one gets to skip Act 2. And here's the problem. You don't know you're in Act 2 until you're in Act 3. Now, when you set out in Act 1, the world is your oyster, anything is possible. And then there's Act 3, when you look back and you see how things worked out for the better. You were transformed. The world was transformed. But when you're in the middle, as far as you know, good news is never going to come. This might just be your life now. And it's a feeling that the prophet Jonah knew all too well. Now, if you've grown up in the church, you might remember the story of Jonah from the flannel graphs in Sunday school. The story starts with God telling Jonah to go to Nineveh and to preach a message of grace to the Ninevites. But Jonah doesn't want to do that. Nineveh was known for being some of the meanest, most vicious people the world had ever known. They didn't deserve God's grace. The writer doesn't tell us what Jonah was thinking at first. All we get is this line in scripture: Jonah got up and went in the opposite direction. He ran the other way as fast as he could, and I don't blame him. He hops in a ship in the opposite direction where he can get a connecting flight to just about anywhere else. Now, this is interesting because this kind of traveling by sea, it wasn't preferable for an Israelite. To an ancient Israelite mind, the sea was a place of chaos. It was a place of unknowns, of uncertainty. But Jonah is so desperate to get away that he gets on board anyway. And a couple interesting things happen next. First, God sends a great storm to the ship that Jonah's on. Through an odd sequence of events we don't have time to get into now, the sailors on the ship with him, they realize that this storm is Jonah's fault because he's running away from his God. And so they toss him overboard like you do. And instantly, the storm stops. Now cut the camera back to Jonah, who's sinking in the deep waters of chaos, waters of unknowns, the place where Israelites are sure God is not. Now he's sure he's going to drown. He's gasping for air. He's thrashing his arms, desperate to get to the surface again. And all of a sudden, he sees it. A giant fish, bigger than any fish he's ever seen. And that's when he realizes the awful truth of it. This fish, it's swimming straight towards him. And before he can think of what to do or where to go, the fish opens its terrible jaws and it rolls its terrible eyes, and with one terrible gulp, it swallows Jonah whole. This is the turning point of the story. The part where Jonah's headed down, 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 so low that the only option for him is certain death. This is Act 2. It's the in-between, the middle part, the point of no return when you're too far in to turn around and not close enough to see the end of the light. A lot of the Bible was written from an Act 2 point of view, from a place of waiting, from a place of confinement, of in between the first part and the happy ending. Cut out the Act 2 part of the Bible and all you'll have is a pamphlet. Genesis 1 and 2 and the very end of Revelation. Most of the Bible was written from inside the conflict, from inside the fish belly, this place of confinement, this waiting room scene. And as I've thought about our world right now, we are in an Act 2 moment. We're stuck in the middle. The part after COVID-19 has become a problem, but before we found a cure. It can be a hopeless, powerless, desperate place when you're stuck in a fish belly. Now, we have several options when we find ourselves in the belly of a fish. The first option is despair. We can declare that this is our life now and live in perpetual disappointment. Or we can deny the pain of it all. We can pretend like it's not that big of a deal. Everything's fine. It's fine. We can despair. We can deny. Or there is another option. We can turn in the belly of the fish toward God. And that's what Jonah chose. It's here in the fish belly that Jonah begins a robust life of prayer. It's in the fish when there's nothing else to do and nowhere left to run that he finally remembers his God. Now, the fact that Jonah prayed isn't that remarkable. Lots of people pray when they're in desperate situations. What's interesting is how Jonah prayed. He doesn't pray a desperate, like, help me get out of this one, God, kind of prayer. Instead, he just prays a prayer of thanksgiving. He prays a prayer of thanksgiving that he learned from the Psalms. Now, he recites a couple Psalms, but one of them is Psalm 100 and 116, which is one of the Psalms that Jesus would have prayed at Passover on the night he went to the cross. Now, confinement, it isn't what any of us want. We prefer Act 1 and Act 3, but so often, it's in Act 2 where God truly meets us. None of our fish bellies in and of themselves can draw us into relationship with God, but they can provide the conditions that make that possible. When we're stripped from all other solutions, stripped from our belief that we can dig our way out of this one, stripped from a wide open Wild West where we might run further away, that's where God opens us and frees us and heals us. If we don't despair, if we don't deny, if we choose instead to go to God in the middle of it all. It had seemed in the story like Jonah needed rescuing from the storms, rescuing from the fish. But maybe those storms, this fish belly, maybe in the end they were rescuing him from something worse, from his self-centeredness, from his whiny, entitled worldview, from being swallowed up in himself. Maybe it was saving Jonah from the death that would have come if he never remembered God's goodness and grace. Because it's there he learned that there is nowhere God will not meet us. There's nowhere that God will not find us. There's nowhere that God will not save us. And it's right in the middle of an Act 2 world that hundreds of years later, another prophet would walk on the scene. Now, this prophet, Jesus, he calmed storms and he preached about grace to a mean people. And one day, his opponents asked him for a miraculous sign to prove who he says he is. And in Matthew 12, he says this. He says, the only sign I will give is the sign of the prophet Jonah. When Jesus is asked to prove who he says he is, he points to Jonah in the belly of the fish because that's where he was going. Now, we as Christians, we talk a lot about what Jesus did on the cross. And we talk a lot about the empty tomb, and we'll talk about all that this week for Holy Week. But we don't talk about this in between a lot. What happened after his death and before he's raised again. The moment when his followers don't know what's going to happen, if there will ever be an Act 3. But it turns out that even in death, even in the grave, even in the worst of all possible circumstances, even where we assume God isn't, that just turns out to be one more place God is. If you can find him in a grave, if you can find him in death, that means anywhere you are, even in quarantine, God's there too. And our invitation is to meet God right here in the middle of Act 2. If you don't know what to say to God, if you don't know how to approach God, you can rely on the words of the Psalms like Jonah did. Or you can just try to find 3 things that you're grateful for, even right now, just today, and offer those to God in gratitude. Whatever your fish belly looks like right now, remember it's only the middle of the story. There's still an Act 3. And the final act is always resurrection, no matter what else we face in this life. We'll celebrate that this Sunday on Easter Sunday, but first, this week, let's let ourselves linger here for a while in Act 2 and see what God does in us here.